Hello, my name is Fagbemi and I'm the narrator for the Group 9 presentation. And today our theme is how non-African Americans view African Americans when it relates to education and how African Americans value education. So I themed this as danger and how non-African Americans view African Americans ever getting an education as a danger to them and destroying their supremacy. The first era I'm going to talk to you about is the era of slavery, which started in 1619. Now, and during that era, most people did not have an education, especially the ones down south, because down south was more of an agricultural area, and people didn't need education down there. During the 1600s, the slaves had no access to education down there at all because their jobs were more labor-type jobs. And their masters definitely didn't want them to get education or to learn how to read and write out of fear of a rebellion. However, to combat the lack of education slaves were getting, they would use gospel songs, church, and slave community meetings to learn much as they can about reading and writing, and to also learn about the Bible, which the slave masters were using to hold them down. One of the many African Americans who had a positive impact on the slavery era was Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave and an abolitionist leader, who helped pave the way for African Americans to even possibly get an education during that time. And at first he had learned education by himself, so he really taught himself how to read and write, and then he would help teach other African Americans how to read and write through his writings that was published up north. Next, I'm going to be talking about the Reconstruction era, in which African Americans had gained freedom. Even though they gained freedom, it was still hard for them to get education, especially down south, because down south they would just teach them the basic math, reading, and writing, but they weren't allowed to get formal education, so they had to go up north if they had any chance of formal education. The reason why former slaveholders did not want African Americans to gain education was in fear that they would be able to start thinking for themselves and that they would gain the same knowledge that they already have, and that was the fear. They did not want African Americans to have the same knowledge that they have, because that would overthrow their white supremacy and their rule over African Americans. As a result of being denied certain amounts of education, African Americans began to open up and form their own schools. Such examples are Howard University, which was the first African American law school formed in the U.S. in 1869, along with Spelman College, which was the first African American female college formed in the United States in 1881. The last thing I want to talk about in the Reconstruction era was a man who had made an impact within the church during this time. His name was Daniel Payne, and he was the 6th bishop of the African Methodist Church. Daniel Payne was best known for being one of the key people in creating an emphasis within the church on education and valuing education. Daniel Payne would encourage other African American ministers to take variety of classes to get their knowledge up and learn different things, along with encouraging young African Americans to get their education by supplying them with as many resources as possible. The last era I want to talk to you about is the Jim Crow law era. And during this era, we faced segregation issues. First barrier they put on us was back earlier in the 1600s, which was slavery. We went from slavery to being free and to now being segregated. So now we're facing an issue of trying to get the same amount of education as the white people did and everything. So notable figures during this era was Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, W. Du Bois. Those were more of the civil rights people that impact the civil rights part of the Jim Crow law, but I wanted to talk to you about the education aspect, and the one figure that I thought had a huge impact during this era was Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born in the last generation of slavery, and years later in his life he became the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, which was in Alabama, and the entire purpose of the Tuskegee Institute was to help black students expand their education and give them formal education and help them feel comfortable getting formal education and not feel like they're being harassed and not allowed to get formal education. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about was separate but equal. It was the main piece of the Jim Crow laws, and it really started up the Jim Crow laws. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that separate but equal was constitutional, and the effect it had on the African American community was huge. It limited the facilities that African Americans can use, the curricular that we could teach, and also limit the books and the resources that African Americans can use for education. The next thing I'm going to also mention is the 1925 Supreme Court case, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, that stated that the state could not compel students to go to public school, but instead it can encourage students to go to private school, which affected the African American community as well, because we couldn't really afford private school, which was another barrier put up in front of us to stop us getting education. However, things began to turn around for the better for African American education. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education overruled separate but equal and banned school segregation, which was a positive turning point for African Americans. It gave them hope for getting a formal education. So in conclusion, some whites viewed African Americans gaining education as a danger or threat to their white supremacy, so they put up multiple barriers over the years, such as slavery and separate but equal, to hold African Americans back. Meanwhile, African Americans gaining education meant for them hopes toward a brighter future and as a means toward getting a great job. That's it for me. I'm going to let the credits roll. This has been Fagbemi Young, and thank you for listening.